So this is just sort of a high-level overview of some of the requirements. But yes, Russell is in the department that if one ends up being licensed as a money transmitter or money services business in Texas, that's the department that he heads. So with that as background, I just wanted to, obviously, and I think for anybody who's involved in this industry, it has become very clear that there's a lot more scrutiny by a lot of regulators. That doesn't always mean that the regulators are concluding that everything is covered, but certainly there are more regulators and more agencies looking at Bitcoin now than there has ever been. So you've got interests ranging from certainly the IRS and the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, where they're looking at issues such as is this taxable? If it's taxable, how is it taxable? What would it qualify for? Are there tax issues related to it? And no surprise, there are many other countries are looking at the same issue. I think perhaps in an international level, there may have been more countries that have decided that it's definitely taxable, and I think the U.S. is still looking at that, although one would suspect they're more likely to lean that way. There is, for those who don't know what this agency is, there's a Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is part of the Department of the Treasury. It's actually an office of the Department of the Treasury, also known by the acronym FinCEN, with the last three letters being capitalized. FinCEN is the U.S. regulatory agency that gets to issue all the Bank Secrecy Act regulations on a federal level. So when you hear, generally speaking, about Patriot Act issues or Bank Secrecy Act, sometimes Know Your Customer, CIP, those acronyms tend to come out of the Bank Secrecy Act. So FinCEN's the regulator that gets to issue the regulations on that. Again, part of the Department of the Treasury. FinCEN was the agency that came out with the virtual currency guidance last March. They've come out with even more recent guidance last month in connection with some of the mining activity. So that's what FinCEN is. Obviously, Senate, as well as parts of Congress, are looking at Bitcoin. You know, you've got some questions that have been raised, especially in other countries, particularly about whether or not there's any issue or possible threat to the currency of the local country. You know, so I think our government is beginning to look at that. Shifting more into a state scenario, though, you've got many states that are grappling with, what do we do with this? Do we think this falls within our regulations? Do we not think it falls within our regulations? You know, New York certainly has had some very publicized activity, ranging from some subpoenas that it issued a number of months back to gather information on some companies, to the more recent discussions and I think some other material that they came out with, where they're debating on wondering whether or not to issue a sort of a quasi money services business license called a bit license, which would be similar to a more traditional money transmitter license, but would be more geared for Bitcoins. I do not believe that New York has decided on that process yet, but it's just something they're considering. One thing to keep in mind is that some people very justifiably in some contexts say, well, this isn't regulated at all. A lot of this, at least some of the state statutes and the Bank Secrecy Act, by and large, speak to monetary value and not just cash or currency. So that's where you've got some breadth in terms of some of the regulatory scope, where there are issues as to whether or not it's already covered under some of the state and federal laws.